this is going to be our first, I'm going to say not book club, even though John, who is an author and has some very best-selling books that we'll come on to in a bit, but we thought it'd be interesting, and we consulted with some of you guys on this idea of taking slightly wider topics or interesting things that are going on in the world and discussing those as well as books. So hopefully enjoy it. Would love to get some feedback at the end, I think. So if you'll probably post a little feedback form with 3 questions or something in that chat. So to the important bit, our guest tonight has started his career in the military and then worked for local government, and then spent more than a decade working for the then Princess of Wales's charities before setting up in the private sector with a really successful, I'm going to say, marketing purpose agency. I know we'll get into it. As I said, he's written several books, and one of the reasons we're now speaking is because last year he launched, after a few years in gestation because of COVID and so on, a brilliant gathering called Anthropy down in Cornwall in the UK, and which is about creating a vision, a new vision, a co-created vision, and action to go with that for this country. Now, lots of our regular book club members are not in this country, but I want to, if you've logged in anyway, thank you. And I'm certain, because John and I have spoken several times, that this will be relevant to all countries. And actually, we're going to discuss some of the big questions facing us as individuals and society as a whole. So just to outline that. So welcome, John, and thank you so much. I've just heard from John that he's seeing us rather than being in the Hay Literary Festival. So I think we should all, I hope we're going to ask as good questions as you'd get there from a brilliant audience there.
Thank you.
That's okay. I wanted to talk a little bit about your background, because when I dug in, obviously we've met, we've talked about Anthropy, we've talked about some of the things you've done and why Anthropy, and we'll get onto all that. But some of your background, then, when I looked at it for this session, was really interesting. And you talk about, and well, firstly, because not many people have worked across that many systems, have worked across the system of the military, the system of government, and the system of sort of third sector or NGO, and then private sector. And maybe just kicking off, I'd love to hear what you think that both, each of them, but also having four systems in your sort of in your character, I want to say, or having to have negotiated those. What does that mean to you, and is that important? Should we all be doing that? I know a friend of mine says we should all be doing all of that.
Yeah. Well, Louise, firstly, thank you for inviting me to do this. It is a great thrill, and thank you for everybody joining in. So I'm sure we'll get some great discussions and some great questions. It's interesting that I don't think anybody's ever asked me about the question that you've just asked there, but undoubtedly, I suppose I look back on 40 years of full-time work and know that actually my ability to do anything today is shaped by the different experiences that I have. And that sounds pretty obvious, but of course, I've got that advantage of a long view now, having gone across the different sectors. And I'm a great believer that the world needs experts, but actually the world also needs generalists. It needs people who can go from role to role, from sector to sector, who can apply a certain set of, let's say, skills into different environments in order to actually, pull the world together in many ways, and often see the innovation or see the overlaps, which perhaps specialists in their own sectors don't. So I know we'll talk about Anthropy later, but that actually anybody turning up at Anthropy had a big sign that said, leave your ego and your silo at the door. And, I try not to have too much of an ego. People may disagree with that, but I also try to dodge silos. And having never been an expert in anything, and having not really been educated in anything, it's allowed me to somehow get a skill set that keeps me employable anyway. But I mean, by way of background, you know, a lot of this is by accident, and I think often you have to find yourself in circumstances that are a bit different. So I grew up in Shropshire, rural county. Went to, you know, state sort of grammar school. It was the end. I was the very last generation to pass 11 plus before it was done away with. Didn't really do well at school. There was no way in the world any university would have taken me at any point in my life. So I left school after A levels. You know, the A level results were actually grade E A levels, which my daughter couldn't believe there were grade E A levels. Yes. There were, because I had two. But I went to work for Lloyds Bank, and you know, in those days, 40 years ago, or over 40 years ago, you know, that was often the normal path. But you know, I got a little bit bored. It was a good job. I was the youngest branch manager for Lloyds Bank at the age of 21. Would you believe?
Oh wow!
I know, it's remarkable.
This is something that's not in your CV.
Well, I mean, why bother putting anything in a CV? But it was quite remarkable. But I was utterly bored with it. So I had also become a territorial army officer about 2 years before, and just thought, actually, I'm enjoying my weekends and my camps away more so than I am doing the day job. So why don't I try and do it professionally? So I ended up doing 10 years as an infantry officer, you know, went through Sandhurst, and that was the first. I mean, I put it all back down to that, really, in that in the army and in the infantry particularly, because everybody has different skill sets, you're really trained to do one thing, which is to go into a chaotic situation that invariably can be dangerous, but to formulate a plan, communicate that plan, and inspire those around you to achieve it with you. And I did that for 10 years and served all around the world, and was, you know, had my hairy moments. But when I came out at the age of sort of 30, 31, I found that skill set applied everywhere that I've been since. So the ability to formulate a plan, often where things are a bit chaotic, communicate it, motivate people to follow you and do it. That served me well for the subsequent 30 years. So yeah, that's what I put it down to.
Brilliant. And as you know, I'm Danish, and there's conscription in Denmark. And actually, it's very hard to get in now because there's so many volunteers, because people see it as leadership training. This is not a planned question at all. How do you think that would be a good idea? Do you think that we should all learn a bit? Because, you know, how you lay it out is beautiful. You know, how do you formulate a plan in changing circumstances?
I mean, obviously, from time to time, you get the Daily Mail comes out and bring back conscription and all that sort of stuff. I don't actually agree with that. I think that it's not right for everybody.
Okay.
It appeals to a certain type. But also, you know, the military is incredibly complex, very technical. So I'm not saying it's wrong in Denmark. And actually, I served alongside Danish. I had a Danish brigadier at one point and served alongside the Danish lifeguards and all the rest of it. But the fact is that, you know, the British Army has been for how many years now, a very, you know, professional army with reservists, and that's worked very well. I mean, the complexity now in systems, you know, colleagues of mine now retiring, or you know, my contemporaries have retired now as generals. So, you know, I'm out of touch even now. But when my friends were continuing as generals up until about 4 or 5 years ago, the sheer complexity, the technology, you know, now things like drones and all of that sort of stuff. I think actually you need, you know, Britain needs its professional forces. I think that some degree of national, let's say, shared experience can be very helpful. I know under Cameron's government, they tried the National Citizen Service, which has been doing good things, and there's other ways of doing it. But whether or not it needs to be trained to be military, I don't know. But, you know, I think I am a great believer in bringing young people together to have that shared experience. And I'm very fortunate, you know, I have friends from that period that, you know, are very dear to me today, and they become lifelong. So there's a lot to be said for it in certain ways.
Yeah, I want to come back to that bit of shared experience, but really interesting. And then left the military and went, and I remember you talking about it, into a bit of local government, which wasn't a deal.
That wasn't quite. Yes, I will come to that. So, but it's interesting at the time. So, if you're a young captain coming out of the army in those days, unless you had something to go to, many went directly into the City of London to sort of get the wage, get the girlfriend, get the Porsche, or whatever it was motivating people in the early 90s. But I didn't really want that. I knew banking hadn't really appealed. And actually, I was already married, so decided to make life. It was the first time I made a life choice rather than a career choice.
Right.
So when you're in the army, you have certain career choices you make, and that means that you're often away from family and things of that kind. But decided actually the family was going to be the life choice. And my first job was actually the landing job out of the army, was to go and work for a medical research charity in Liverpool. And, you know, all my friends who were heading in that direction to the City of London thought, what, you're going to Liverpool to work the rough end of Liverpool on this? And I said, yeah, you know, let's do it. And it was tremendous. I was the development director, then I became CEO, funded and created a medical institute at the university. And it was an extraordinary experience because actually, again, having met lots of soldiers in the army from diverse backgrounds and, you know, very different to my own, here working in a city like Liverpool, extraordinary, full of character, you know, full of really, you know, tremendous people, but, you know, some pretty tough economic deprivation, things like that, affecting health. But I was then, there was an initiative called Tony Blair did it, the modernisation of local government.
Right.
Wanted to encourage non-local government people to go into local government to bring different thinking. And I went into a city council in the north, and I was rubbish at it. I mean, I was awful, and I hated it. I mean, it was the worst work environment I've ever been at, and I was definitely not suited to that environment. So I'm sure I was awful to work with, and yeah, it had no scope for enterprise, no scope for innovation, no scope for anything that played to my tunes, because of the bureaucracy and the way in which things were done. So there's always a good experience to come out of these things. So I did it for 2 years, and the role and responsibility encompassed regeneration, urban regeneration, and some of the work that was being done in that city. As a result, it gave me more qualifications to actually go and then work for the Prince's Charities, in particular business in the community, where I was very fortunate to then spend another decade, which was really the next formative period of my experience. So I doubt I would have got the job at BITC if I hadn't had the 2 years experience around regeneration.
Something. And that's often how careers go, isn't it? That the thing you hate is still a springboard or stepping stone.
And I apologise to everybody that had to work for me or with me in those 2 years, because it was a bloody nightmare. There we go. It was a nightmare for me and probably a nightmare for them. Yeah.
And just hopping back, so you talked about the skills of the military and so on, and just as a kind of thing coming into the role of the military now, still important that it's professional. We've had some conversations around, you know, is the military a way of mobilizing people or being mobilized in the sort of battle against climate change? And that, do you think that the role of the military is changing, should be changing? Before we leave that,
so people, you know, to be perfectly frank, people who are through and through civilians and don't have experience of the military and probably see it as something that, you know, marches up and down the Mall at various events and things like that, probably don't probably like to think about what the military is about. The harsh reality is the military is not about, you know, helping out in disasters. It's not about helping, you know, on fairs and putting parades on or whatever. It does all of those things, but actually fundamentally the military is about the controlled application of violence. And we don't like it in a civilized society, but we know that actually if we don't have the ability to deter, or indeed the ability to project force in a very violent way, then, you know, the world can be pretty awful for us. I mean, we're seeing what's happening in Ukraine now, but, you know, that only is resisted because they have a strong military and have mobilized in that way. So fundamentally, I am slightly concerned when the military is always seen by any UK government as the backstop for everything. Yes. So, for example, you know, there's a natural disaster like floods or something, it's, you know, the military responds. Or the foot and mouth crisis, which I was working for the Prince of Wales then, you know, the military have to respond. Or, you know, frankly, the border people go on strike, so the military have to respond. You know, that is not their job. And although, of course, the military is there as a reserve, I think it's pretty appalling, I have to say, when military personnel are put into positions where they have to do other duties, often when they're paid less than the people who may go on strike and things like that. So the reason I feel strong about this was during my time, there was a fireman strike. For more pay, my soldiers and I had to be ready to deploy with very old, they're called green goddesses, very old military fire appliances, to potentially go into very hazardous situations without the equipment or the training that the firemen had, yet my soldiers were earning less than the firemen. And I just think, you know, that can't be right in the 21st century. We should have other solutions to always drawing on this group of people because we don't have a choice. That's my view.
No, that's good. I'm going to look for questions on this in the chat.
Sure,
if anybody's got other opinion, no, because you put it very, very well. And again, it's that thing of, it sort of assumes that everybody's twiddling their thumbs and can be drawn on at any point in time when needed, which isn't the case, as far as I know.
No. And we've got far fewer people twiddling their thumbs now than we had when I was in the army. I mean, it's a much smaller thing. You know?
No, thank you. I just wanted to circle back on that. And then you talked about the business in the community. Was this where your sort of purposeful businesses ideas started brewing? Talk to me about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So now I'm always amazed by, you know, children at the age of 10 suddenly become purposeful and start creating amazing businesses or changing the world and all that stuff. You know, frankly, I was never like that. You know, I mean, I don't know if it's my generation or not. I'm sure it's not, because there are great people, you know, like John Elkington or whatever head. But no, I mean, the insight for me was that suddenly I was going all across, certainly firstly across the northwest of England, looking at different circumstances that we're trying to get business to have a positive effect about. And then I was asked to go to London to head up the Prince of Wales's own personal programs and anything that he had a personal passion for. So the remarkable thing was I might be on a hill farm in Cumbria talking to 3 generations of families about the marginal nature of surviving, you know, in that. Then I could be in a mosque in Leicester. I could be in a school in Tower Hamlets. I'd be in the boardroom of KPMG. You know, I'd be in Clarence House, whatever. And suddenly you're across all manner of UK sort of agendas, institutions, organizations, and most importantly, people. So you're meeting people, you know, you're meeting imams, you're meeting global CEOs, you're meeting hill farmers, you're meeting head teachers. That was a unique privilege that BITC gave me in those 10 years. And, you know, it was an extraordinary experience to be able not only to mobilize business for good, but also from my perspective, to see the potential of that. And so what we would have called CSR was obviously, that was the language we used in those days, but that was the next definitive period in my sort of consciousness. Yeah.
Super interesting. And obviously, you know, shifting circumstances, I guess, or environments on a daily basis, as you said, from a mosque to KPMG, and etc. Are there any moments that stand out to you where you were utterly, I'm not going to say dumbfounded because I can't imagine you being short of words, but sort of really surprised, or you thought you learnt something particular, either about yourself or about how the world works?
Yeah, I mean, so in that period, I ended up not only running a plethora of different programs, from rural action to fishing communities to supporting young Muslims in schools and things like that, but I also ended up doing things internationally, and I'll talk about the international bit as well. But I suppose, to be perfectly frank, even though I'd had experience both in Liverpool and in the northwest of some of the pockets of deprivation, I was most shocked when I would go to a place like Burnley and find that effectively the economy had collapsed. So, for example, you know, you could pick up a house for £10,000 because there were hundreds of them and nobody wanted them. You know, and this was, you know, Victorian stock, you know, that was just abandoned effectively. You could go and see, you'd go and meet families where actually you were facing the 3rd generation. I find this extraordinary, the 3rd generation of somebody unemployed. So you had the grandfather had never really been employed, who would be in his sort of late 50s or whatever. The son or whatever would never have been employed. Now they've got a teenager without employment as well. And I just thought, how do you ever get any aspiration? How do you get any? This is not their fault. This is just the circumstances they've been born into. So what shocked me most was the levels of poverty and deprivation that we were seeing in our cities, particularly because, unfortunately, I'm in a rural county, and it's an affluent county and all the rest of it. So that made me feel that I'd also at that time actually had our daughter, we'd had our child. And I think that becoming a parent changes the way in which you look at the world, undoubtedly.
Mm.
In the first instance, I thought, gosh, I want everything that's great for my daughter. But instantly, I thought, actually, it's not just my daughter. It's all daughters and all sons. What is happening to the children in this? So I was particularly engaged with young people and things like that. But also, I have to say, sometimes I find it really shocking when I visit some of the rural communities or the fishing communities, where the ability for them to make any sort of, it's not even a profit, if you're fishing in a small fishing community in South Shields or somewhere like that, or if you're on a marginal hill farm somewhere, you're supporting often 2 or 3 generations. You actually not, it's subsistence really. You don't have any spare money. You don't have any money to go on a holiday or anything which the rest of us take for granted. And the reality is, of course, if you drive through the Yorkshire moors or something like that, rural poverty looks picturesque.
Yes.
People will go and paint a little crumbly cottage, but that little crumbly cottage demonstrates the fact that that was once and now is nothing more, and there's so much complexity in all of this. But that was most shocking. I think the most touching thing, though, which I've had certain experiences in the military which were pretty tough, but again, harking back to the leadership of our now king, I was traveling down to London one day, and I had a message on my phone that he wanted to speak to me. So I got into a place in St James's Square and got on the phone, patched through. And this was 2010, and there had been horrendous floods in Pakistan. I mean, they've been repeated since, but people will recall that an area the size of England was flooded in Pakistan. And he phoned and said, John, this is appalling, this is horrendous. Do you think there's anything I can do? And I said, well, leave it with me, sir. He was going to make a donation to the Islamic relief charities and things, as he normally does. And I looked at this and I thought, well, actually, we have a UK diaspora of Pakistani origin, wealthy individuals and business leaders. I knew some in the Middle East as well. I spoke to the Dragon, James Khan, and said, James, I gather that you're going out. And in those days, I was able to appoint him as a representative of the Prince of Wales, which I did. And within 10 days, I, with James, led a visit to the northern part of Pakistan, the Northern Territories up to Afghanistan borders, which was pretty precarious anyway for security reasons. But as a result of that, we were able to come back, report to the king, and we raised a Pakistan Recovery Fund. We had a big gala dinner, we raised a lot of money, and the prince's convening ability, but triggered by his concern, made that happen. But I have to say, I walked into a village, and there's people that are friends of mine that were there with me. I walked into a village where the poorest of people that you could imagine had lost everything. And for the first time in probably 20 years, I had to go around a corner and wept, because the sheer humanity of the whole thing and the inability to really do anything but to see and report and then hope something can happen. Whenever any of us get fed up because a train is late or we don't get the particular type of coffee we want or anything like that, we should fundamentally remember that everybody on this call is more privileged than half of the society we have in this country and most of the people in the world. I think sometimes in life you need those things to remind you what really matters.
Thank you. And yeah, it's got me wondering of whether something similar happened with the recent Pakistani floods, for example, which I don't know. And
it didn't, but well, I know there's enormous outpouring of tremendous philanthropic activity when that happens. I think one of the things we should never doubt is the charitable instinct of the British people. This is demonstrated time and time again. The Disasters and Emergencies Committee, which obviously responds as a collective of charities, is incredibly effective at this. And I think that, you know, we have a great propensity now to sort of damn everything about our country. But actually, when it comes to disasters miles and miles overseas, we're pretty good at responding as general public, often matched, of course, by UK government funding as well. Yeah.
And maybe just you touched on the concern of the king, and I just want to touch a little bit about, because one of the reasons I thought it was fun to have you squished into May rather than another time of the year was this, of course, was still, you know, we're just still in the month of the coronation. And a coronation that on one hand was incredibly traditional, but also, at least to my mind, and again, you know, being a foreigner and so on, had some really strong indications that the king wants to project or help to amplify a different or a positive vision for the country, both in terms of inviting all the faith leaders in and making them part of the session, if not the official ceremony, of you know, the light shows around nature, all those kinds of things. And I just wonder, you know, what's the potential here? This is me with my you know, because at the same time we've heard, of course, just before, you know, around the Queen's death, that was the king will have to be quiet and not mention anything, and then we can see the difference somehow.
So well, firstly, I don't speak obviously for the king or anything of that kind. I only have been very fortunate to have an interesting role, because after I left in 2010 to set up my own agency, he actually asked me to represent him on a number of issues, which I did up until 2017 privately. And he asked me to be a trustee of one of his key international initiatives. So what I would say is this, and it's my opinion really, if you look at what will be the king's legacy, his legacy really will have been shaped by what he did as Prince of Wales. He is the longest serving Prince of Wales in our history. And of course, his charitable endeavours, the most famous being the Prince's Trust, but many, many other things mean that there is a lasting legacy that has affected, I'm sure it is millions of people around the world in a very positive way. And I think sometimes we have to just bear in mind that that is not part of the job description of the Prince of Wales, you know, I mean, because there isn't one, you know. Frankly, he could have just done what a lot of others did in history, which is be a bit of a playboy, and that was it. So the reality is an individual took responsibility and was passionate about things. And if you look back in that period of time, took many of the things from the margins and helped move them to the mainstream. So we think about his passions for nature, his passions for certain farming techniques and food, things which often many people on this call, of course, now would see as inherent to the way in which they live their lives. Actually, when the Prince started out, though, was not the case. And often he was, of course, criticised as being a bit of a quack and all of that sort of stuff. So actually, you know, he has moved so much on. So then you see the reflection through the ceremony. And I think it was an interesting, I mean, I'm very, you know, I'm a traditionalist, you know, so I'm looking there, picking up the guardsmen for not being straight or whatever.
I was in awe of how straight they were, John. So
well, I mean, they were good. I won't mention the regiment that I thought was a bit out, because that's not fair. I mean, I can't help my background any more than anybody else can help theirs. But you know, it was a combination of the traditional, but it also, as you say, had these subtle differences. So if right the way through to the design, for example, of the commemorative logo, which was all very nature-based and things of this kind. Now, what does that say? I mean, from my perspective, that says here is a man that we know embraces history, culture, and tradition, because that is how he sees that. But also is someone that actually embraces humanity, its connection with nature, and he wanted reflected in both the ceremony and, let's say, the peripheral aspects of the identity, etc., those things that he personally cared about. And surely if we accept a constitutional monarchy, surely what we want in such a figure is a combination not only of continuing the traditions that we have accepted, but also that personal flavor, that personal character. You know, it is a very different and it will be a very different reign to that which the Queen had, because the King is very different to the Queen. But that's something we should embrace and evolve with. But I think his great, to go to the point of can he be silent or this, that, and the other, I think that he fundamentally knows and understands better than anybody else the delicate nature of the role he now has. Yeah. And he, I'm sure that won't be a challenge for him. Yeah.
No, thank you. No, I think that's good insight, because as you said, most of us on the call, I think, align with him on many of the things he has chosen to champion. So hope that.
I mean, and then I think one other thing, if anybody, I've been very fortunate. I've traveled on the Royal train. You get up, you have breakfast with him, and he's concerned about what he's going to go and do in the next day. And then at night, you're saying, well, why do you do this? And why didn't we do that? And can we do more? Basically, this is somebody who understands that he has influence. He has the ability to convene and bring people to, not necessarily says this is what needs to be done, but just brings people and says, look at this, see what this situation is, and then you determine whether or not something needs to be done. And, I think so often it's been a case of him using his influence to get people to look at an issue, which has then resulted in so much that's come out of it.
Yeah. That actually leads to a couple of people have put questions that are very similar on here that I feel like is at the right time right now. That this idea of how do we inject aspiration into left behind communities, and the sort of how do we ensure, in a sense, that these communities, these intergenerational poverty-stricken communities, are represented. And the question, so it's James and Pauline, and if I haven't, please add in the chat if I haven't represented it well. I've shortened it a little bit, but how do we give that? How do we inspire?
Yeah. So my observations, I never profess to have answers to so specific questions. What I do have is my observations made about what I've seen or witnessed in the past. I think fundamentally, as a nation, I don't know how it compares elsewhere, but as a nation, we have got ourselves into a situation where we are continuing to invest in systems that don't work. And we think throwing more money at the system will somehow solve it, because actually that is an easy thing to do. So governments after governments after governments will throw more money at a system that isn't working, because actually they're not utilizing other things, which I'll talk about in a moment, that could change the system. There's too much inherent investment in a system in so many different ways that you can't get the innovation that you actually require. So even when you see pockets of great innovation that have effect, they don't become replicable, they don't become scalable, because the system works against them. I actually had a meeting earlier today where I was talking to a particular chief executive of a non-profit organization, but also happened to be the very successful founder of a very successful business who had funded this charity and created the charity, talking about the intervention exactly to that question. So young people that have been left behind in their early teens, which exactly the system just doesn't even know where they are. So they can't even get to them to help them. And the reason that they're not is there's a whole myriad of things within the system that is allowing people to hide behind process, to hide behind blank screens on like this, to hide behind the sort of tick boxes, rather than actually remembering the purpose of why they're engaged in this, which is to solve the issue. Forget the tick boxes, forget the process, just make these things happen in a different way. And one of the things when we come on to Anthropy is that I wanted to try and see where we could find those examples that are working somewhere and give them a bigger platform to say, actually, it's shameful that we've got these situations where the system's in the way of actually making it happen. And I've spent half of my last 20 years in the non-profit space. I don't say this without experience, but I think charities have a lot to answer for in this, because they are part of the system. They are part of the vested interests in keeping the status quo. We, as a nation, did something remarkable during the COVID period. We actually solved homelessness. There was no homeless on our streets during lockdown. And then what happens? We open up and it all goes back. And now we're shamed again by the numbers of homeless that we've got. Why? Because the system didn't actually say, okay, look, we actually solved it during lockdown in this particular way. Let's just learn from this and think how the hell we do it. So I don't have the answer to any of the individual things. What I do think fundamentally is that the systems get in the way of innovative thinking. I think partnerships, cross-sector thinking, solutions in that way. If you think of where things were remarkable during COVID, like the development of the vaccine, for example, where we as a nation actually led the way. I think a third of all vaccines in the world came out of the research that we had, etc. It's quite remarkable for a country of our size, actually. Well, that happened because academia, the private sector and government came together with an urgent national need, and they broke all the rules, frankly, of, trials and goodness knows what, because actually, like a wartime, you've got to make things happen to save lives. So I'm not sort of talking about other things that might have gone right or wrong in government, but in that instance, those three sectors worked in a way that broke all the normal structures, and it worked.
So,
and the of that.
It's so interesting you talk about exactly that, breaking rules. I had a meeting with the chief exec for a big UK company this morning, and one of the things we talked about was the need for collaboration, both across sector but also within sectors, to an exchange of information. And we talked about the sort of the issue of antitrust. How do you balance that? Because he said, well, my lawyers are saying I can't talk to these people, and I don't know how we can make this work otherwise. There's some really interesting rules in the current system that need to be broken somehow.
I think every chief executive should sit at a boardroom table with their opposite number and all the rest of it, and they should have the lawyer next to them. And when they're talking about stuff, if their lawyer hasn't consistently kicked them under the table to try and get them to shut up, then they're not doing their job right. I mean, I'm sorry, but, if we talk, of course, there's commercial sensitivity, but if we talk about fundamentally the issues that our country faces, from education, from mental health, from all of these things that, are really, things that we should be concentrating on, or frankly, the biggest issue we've got is the NHS. I mean, the NHS doesn't function. It functions to an extent, but it doesn't function to the standard that we would all want. I've had some excellent NHS treatment in the last 4 or 5 months, so I'm not criticizing it at all, but you only need to read the stats about cancer. The system needs change, but it won't happen because nobody's prepared to come out of the system. There's not cross-party political agreement to do it. It's all seen as something that, I mean, don't even get me on that.
We won't go there. We won't go there. All I'd say is, so one of the, when we work within companies with innovation, what we've, mostly organizations and systems have antibodies to change, and you see it because innovation gets quashed, which is why often sort of sometimes the sensible CEOs will spin it out and say, we'll keep it out there, so it doesn't feel like a threat to the existing system. And yet, unless you can then grow it to overtake the old, it's a bit like that, right? That we're in that position, but on a global scale.
And to a certain extent, in some areas that will happen, because actually the evolution of a business need or a social need will outgrow the old static system. So, when did you last go into a phone box and use a phone box? I genuinely can't remember. I don't even know if they've got them anymore. I mean, I genuinely don't know, because so if you'd have hied off, well, O2 did, and they got them. Let's not go there either. But the fact is that there was an evolution. If you did not have that ability to hide stuff off, you'd been dead. So to a certain extent, there'll be the natural evolution of that thing.
No, it's interesting, isn't it? And whether we can still get away, I guess, with a natural evolution, or whether there has to be, sorry, that's a dog shaking, whether there's it has to be more dramatic. Well, at this point, when we've got to.
Well, things will get more dramatic because what's happening with AI at the moment. I mean, the AI offers humanity probably extraordinary opportunity, but also extraordinary concerns and threats in a whole myriad of different ways, because we've opened up a new sort of horizon that we don't understand. So actually, so some people will fight against it. others will be concerned, and others will want to embrace it and run in different directions. Well, you know, that will mean that there will be both evolution, but there'll also suddenly be radical adoption, you know, and we, you know, this is the frontier aspect. But we have to bear in mind, again, if we think about humanity and humans, that has been our history for millennia. You know, at one point, we all sat there and thought, what's over that hill? And we walked over the hill out of comfort into danger. Yes. And then we saw, oh, there's another hill. And we went again, and we went again, and we went again. That's the nature of what we do.
Yes. And it feels like we live in particular times. I'm just seeing a couple of questions on systems, sort of systemic issues and changes. So a couple on, do you think that the skill gained from learning to adaptively create plans in times of chaos, is that equally applicable in times of relative stability, like 6 years ago, as it is in the current time of polycrisis? This Paul, is that Paul Ellingstad, is that you?
So, so firstly, from a personal perspective, I just know those are the skill set that allow me to be as successful as, you know, in different things that I've done. And I do think that linked to that has been the fact that if you scan across different sectors and things, you'll pick up different ideas, which allow you to then be a little bit more innovative in the application of that. Now, when things are calmer and more comfortable, and you know, things can take more steady progress, then you can actually use those skills, of course, to have longer lead-in times, greater refinement, etc., etc. But the critical thing about being able to do that is that, and particularly when you're trained in the military, is that there is a process that, I mean, it doesn't naturally happen. You're actually trained to consider certain key questions in a methodical way, and then eventually it just becomes an automatic process. And the reason it becomes an automatic process is because when it becomes very fast and very complex and very dangerous, you need to do it without going through a tick list. So in civilian life, if you've got something that urgently needs requirement and you've got that skill set where you can do it calmly and collected in a way, then the critical thing is actually your ability to make those decisions. But the critical thing you need to know is as much information as you can on what you're trying to tackle. So actually, when there's so much going on, the thing is to determine what is important information and what is less important, concentrate on the important information, and base, you know, if there's time pressure, base your decision on that. That's about the best advice I can say on that.
So just related, do you think scenario planning and project management, as per the military, are they essential for fighting climate change? Says Nadine.
There is, I mean, I'm sort of loath to sort of, my view on this is that if you, so far, I think our military have a reputation for very good planning. Yeah. Not everything in the military is right. You know, there's sometimes appalling HR issues and things like that. But one thing that the military has in its DNA is the ability to formulate very complex plans. So if you were to say, should the military, I mean, I'm not advocating a military takeover, but if you're suggesting that the military could be, you know, perhaps former military generals or whatever, could be brought into a government department on anything from, you know, pensions or education or climate change or whatever, and perhaps bring a rigor or a cut through, that might be possible. The challenge, I'm afraid to say, is the system would balk against it. So, you know, with greatest respect to civil servants, if you get anybody coming in from outside and you have been created, you've got your process of looking at, you know, social welfare or something, you're not going to welcome people coming in from outside asking difficult questions in obtuse ways. But you know, the military thinking has something to add, but it does then depend very much on the willingness of people to embrace that. You know, and then I think it's a combination of both. I always used to say, well, I still do bore people with the fact that if I had a problem, if this phone was the problem, and I asked 3 bankers for a solution, I'd get a banker's solution. If I asked 3 teachers, I'd get a teacher's solution. And if I asked 3 artists, I'd get an artist's solution. But if I asked a banker, a teacher, and an artist, we'd get something completely different. And it would be more interesting and more innovative because of those different perspectives.
So that's back to inclusivity and breaking down silos where you started. And on one hand, I want to touch on purpose, but I feel like we need to move to anthropy now, if because I don't want to shortchange anthropy, and I know it sort of came out of looking at sort of this age of purposefulness. You know, I always say I worked in purposeful brands from 2007 to 2013, but it felt like a trend at the time to a certain extent, but at the same time, purpose is I guess more fundamental than that, both for human beings. And you've referred to the king and his purpose. It was really it's come up several times already. So let's sort of touch on purpose and glide into anthropy and why.
So the first thing I'd say about purpose is that, to me, it is the evolution of a process. So the story was, I finished a business in the community in 2010 because I actually got disillusioned with CSR, and it was time for me to move on. So CSR, really, through the financial crisis, you saw as peripheral to the way in which people led their businesses. It was the nice bits on the side. Now, we didn't use the language of purpose when I left in 2010. And it wasn't until around about 2016 that word started to be used. And actually, to go back to the book theme, I was asked to write a book in 2016, which was, well, they thought CSR 2, and I said, no, it's not. It's about the purpose of business. And my purpose, you know, I define purpose of business not to sell something, but to solve something. So it was saying right at the core of a sustainable, long-term, successful business is that you're solving a human need or you're solving a planetary need. And if you do that well, then you'll be able to have success because people need that solution. And I wrote a book called The Power of Purpose, which got to number 3 at Smith's and was listed by Forbes Top and whatever. And that sort of cemented a lot of the language and the thinking. And then at that time, I moved into, that was more strategy, my own agency. And then it moved into the communication side, which I've been with Omnicom for the last 5 or 6 years. Now, the thing about all of that was that actually, if you think about it as a continual evolution, purpose rides high at the moment, but recently we've had ESG coming in the last few years, and that's built on sustainability and CSR and CCI and corporate philanthropy, you know, keeps going. But when you try and see the role of the individual, so we're talking here as people as well as the organizations that we're part of. The best alignment for people is where your own personal sense of purpose aligns with the work that you do. And I remember defining in the book, I thought, actually, I keep going on about this purpose stuff, which was still pretty new at that time. I need to define my own purpose. And I looked back over my life and saw that the jobs that I was most happy in, where I performed best, where those around me were more engaged, was where I did really do one thing. And it was the same in the military, and it was the same in BITC, and it was the same elsewhere, which was where I helped people maximize their potential. And I thought, you know, my purpose in life is to help people maximize their potential for good. And I try and do that through my commercial work, and I try and through my charitable work. Now, when I work with organizations that are also trying to do that, I'm happy, people around me are happy, and we do good work. Now, I had been commuting weekly to London for 17 years, and then COVID hit, and we all went into lockdown, and that was all a bit of a shock. And I had agreed that year, or prior to that year of 2020, to write another book about marketing in the purposeful age, because there's a great risk of purpose wash emerging. And I wanted to get back to human truth, really, in marketing communications. And, you know, and both books are still available, I have to say. And
we have to promote them. I don't have them. Normally, I would hold up the book.
I'm not here to sell books, but they are available. And the foreword for Truth Be Told, the last book, was actually written by Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum. So we got through this year. I was very concerned about the economic and social impact of COVID. I genuinely thought, how the heck are we as a country and a world going to come out of this, and what are all the ramifications? I then received his foreword in January 21 and thought, you know, actually, we need a sort of Davos gathering in the UK, but not just the business elite. We need people who are leading great social projects. We need charity leaders. We need academics. We need people who can influence change to come together to really think, how do we build Britain back better than it was before? And aligned to that, and I have to say, I don't want this sort of lost, was that I've become so concerned in the last 5 years, really, or so, about the polarization that we see in society and on our social media, etc. And I know many others think back to 2012, where we hosted the Commonwealth Games, not the Commonwealth, the
Olympics, yeah.
And we also had the Queen's Jubilee that year as well. And I think we were a nation that was quite content with ourselves. You know, we were confident, we embraced the world, we put on a great show, we were proud of what we'd done. Well, since then, I'm afraid it's just been downhill. You know, Brexit hasn't helped, COVID hasn't helped. You know, everybody's sniping at each other. And I'm afraid I don't see the example in politicians. I don't see the examples coming from people who are perhaps able to just disentangle the rhetoric from what they really believe in. You know, we've become so adept as a society to say what we're against rather than what we're for, or, you know, damn people because they disagree with us on one thing. That was never the case. So I wanted a gathering that had a different sort of sense to it, an ethos of mutual respect and concern about the things we could all agree on. That's really what arose for Anthropy.
Yeah. And does that link just to, I know that in 2012 you worked with the Jubilee Hour, which is mass mobilization of people. And again, it sort of feels like it has a shadow of also bringing people together is
yes. I mean, so actually, if you go back into, so creating the Pakistan Recovery Fund for the King, that was after I'd left BITC. That was me as a private individual supporting him. And I did a few other things. But in the Jubilee year, I heard of this idea where we sort of came up with this idea where you could try and recognize the Queen's 60 years of service by getting people to volunteer 60 minutes of service. I thought, instead of just having a tea party, and I'm not against tea parties, I mean, that's great, have a street party, that's fine. But, you know, why don't we actually do something, you know, that has an impact on our neighbours or our scout group or whatever? And if it encourages new people to volunteer, then they may stick with it. And so I got everybody from Joan Collins giving an hour visiting an old people's home to, I don't know, the Duchess of Cambridge's hairdresser did the hair of somebody, and we got loads of mobilization. It was a private sort of campaign just to get people to do something. And at that time, I think it was 3.7 million. I can't remember. The remarkable thing was that because I sort of pushed it all out in the public domain online, we even had 40,000 volunteers in New Zealand, which I hadn't really even focused. And we had volunteers in Pakistan, and we had volunteers in Canada, because it was powered by social media. It was created a particular web platform. And, you know, people really embraced a very simple idea. And again, to think about systems, and then I'll shut up. But I remember thinking, right, I must get the great voluntary organizations together. And I convened in my little office all these experts on volunteering, and I won't mention names. And the first thing that one came up and said, right, John, yes, you must have an action day. You must do it on this particular day. And I thought, okay, but what happens to all the people who can't do it on that particular day?
Yeah.
So let's not have an action day. Let's just do it over a period of 4 or 5 months. And then everybody sort of was coming up with other things like, well, they've all got to wear purple. They've got to do it on environment. Well, they've all got to do it in. I thought, no, hang on a minute. You're putting barriers in the way of people getting engaged. Let people do what they want to do. If they just want to go and cut the neighbour's lawn, do it. If they want to pick up litter, do it. If they want to do it formally with the guides or something, do it. But don't start to put restrictions on. So one of the things that I've always tried to do when I've developed other sort of programs in this way is to, yes, bring something that people can feel a part of. You know, this is them bringing, you know, their own thinking into something, but also try not to put too many barriers up. Now, that may seem contrary with Anthropy because there's a fee to pay to get in and things like that, but there are reasons for that. But, you know, really what you want to do is to people to embrace an idea and then for them to take that idea forward. And that's simply what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, brilliant. And just for the record, just in case anybody doesn't know, you would have all seen it in our emails, etc. So Anthropy last year was about 1,200 people meeting. There were about 300 panels ish. You can correct me, or we can put the details. Is that right?
No, we had 184 sessions.
184. So
I'm not going to try 300. That would break me completely.
That was quite a lot. Over 3 days hosted in the Eden Project in Cornwall. It will double this year. Very excited to have had some of those discussions with you and Lucy. And how are you hoping for it to be different this year? Or why should people, we've got over 30 odd people right now. Why should they come?
So in the first instance, you have to understand what Anthropy is about. So Anthropy was designed to say, how can we build a better Britain? But it was also to try and get away from the short-termism side of it. So everybody's dogged by, short-termism. So I set 4 questions. What is the quality of life we want in Britain for the next 30 years? So the next generation. What are the qualities of the place, the built and natural environment? What are the qualities of a good economy? And what are the qualities we share internationally to work on shared issues? Now, all the sessions feed up into those questions, but they range from everything about culture and art and heritage, the environment, education, the care, NHS, business, etc. So there's an awful lot going on. And if you're familiar with the Eden Project, you have these great biomes. And the reason I chose to put it down there rather than put it on in London or anywhere else was that I wanted a place of significance, not just convenience. So there is no better illustration of an innovative use of a redundant industrial space. This was an old quarry, redundant. Now it's a beautiful place, the world's largest indoor rainforest, etc. But also I felt that if we could get, for example, CEOs of companies sitting in a rainforest talking about sustainability with a partridge walking by, that is a very different experience than doing it in a lecture room in the Queen Elizabeth Centre in Westminster. It gets people thinking differently. So it worked, and we had everybody from Darcy Bussell, the ballerina, to Anthony Solden, the historian, the chairman of KPMG, the CEOs of X, Y, and Z, in a different type of environment, talking about different things with different people. And so what people consistently say to me, the magic of that was not just what happened in the sessions, but what happened over coffee and lunch and walking between buildings where they met new connections. And it was designed really to do 3 things. I wanted 3 Ps. I wanted new partnerships to emerge. So I'm really pleased to say that I consistently hear that people have met people at Anthropy and have developed new partnerships across sectors. The second was that I wanted practices to be changed. So I hope that people in the audience might hear of different practices in other organizations, think, actually I can take that back to my own organization and make that change happen. And the third was that I hope it will affect policies going forward. So what's different this year is a number of different things. Firstly, we're using the spaces slightly differently. We found some new spaces. We're trying to ensure the smaller intimate sessions where you might have 20 people or 30 people are retained because people value those. But we're also going to try and make certain more sort of larger, more inclusive, where there'd be 300 or 400 people having more of a shared experience, because we only really did that once at Anthropy, and it was very well received. What we didn't realize was nobody wanted to leave the site at night. So there was one pop-up pub, but you've got 1,000 people trying to get in there. That's a bit of a challenge. So
hard to get a drink, as far as I remember.
Well, we've got other things going on in the evenings, because people didn't want to go back to their accommodation. They wanted to stay networking. So we'll have more entertainment, more bars and food. We're also putting a couple of films on during the evenings as well, so documentary types, and we've got the producers there. So, people have made world-class documentaries with David Attenborough and people like that, so that will happen. And also, most importantly, what we're going to do is canvass the opinion of the people on site. So we are going to try and introduce different ways where we're asking delegates questions around the topics, so that we can draw out of this a number of key indicators about where people's sentiment is going across a whole range of questions, covering all the agenda. Because we then hope that if we turn that into a report and put it onto the table of policymakers at any level, that might start to affect the way in which they think about it. So there are fundamental changes happening. We're using some of the space differently, as I mentioned, more networking spaces and things of that kind, a few more exhibitions. And we've got everything from robots that are due to turn up to virtual reality, And of course, we're looking for more delegates to make the richness. I think the one thing for those that weren't there, Louise, and your testament to this, is that out of just over 1,000 or so people registered to be there, 450 ended up as speakers. So we have people invited to being speakers in different ways. But once people have registered, we also try and offer people where their expertise matches speaking opportunities on panels and in discussions in the room.
It was one of the things that I thought was most extraordinary. It was that it felt like anybody, both in the audience, could have been on the panels. In a lot of cases, obviously there were incredible people on panels and extraordinary people, but that sense that this was a discussion and a coming together of well-informed, not master and pupils. There's a couple of questions that have just kind of triggered something in me, and I think I'm going to paraphrase Paul and Dermot, so apologies again. But do you think Anthropy could help, I guess, instigate both courage and new values and convey that? So Paul was asking, is it the case that we have the money but we're missing the courage? And Dermot was asking about, do we need to shift, or how do we shift the conception or concept of value in contemporary society and build political will to recognize true public value? I just wonder, could we do that with Anthropy this year, please?
Well, they are cracking questions, and thank you to the two that raised them. So please come down and register and get in and ask questions. But joking aside, I think qualities. Firstly, the qualities side is right to the core of all of this. It's the qualities we want to embrace as individuals and as a nation. That actually came out quite strongly from last year's Anthropy. So a lot of the feedback led to a report that is available on our website. People were asking us actually for what are the principles, what are the qualities that we should embrace as anthropists. So we actually distilled those into what is called the Anthropy Charter. And people don't need to use it, but if it's helpful, then people may wish to, and there's certain principles there. They also looked at wanting to connect with others. So we're creating a new network, and also a pathway to collaborate where they look at their own individual action and then collaborative action. That's a bit of a side thing, but on the value, so I think the qualities that we need to embrace personally and collectively absolutely is the core of what I hope those discussions should be. And, being of a certain ilk, going back to what I said earlier, where I'm disappointed in the standard of some of the public dialogue, etc., that is linked to courage, because it's not courageous to send a tweet that just spouts off nonsense or is rude to people. That's not courage. That's just cowardice, frankly. The reality is that what you need courage is where you go across the room to people that you don't agree with and have a respectful, open discussion in order to have an open mind, and that's the sort of thing. I think politicians as well, I don't know, I'm just so disappointed, frankly, across all the political sphere. I mean, we invite politicians, and individually, when you meet them, they're all very pleasant and all the rest of it. But for whatever reason, they're as influenced by this desire to be the next soundbite, the next short-termism, the damn the other person because we can't agree on this, that, and the other. I think our issues like climate change, the NHS, things like that are so big now, we will not get solutions by politicians and others just trying to score points off each other. So the one thing I would say about Anthropy is if Anthropy comes together as a body of people, and if you take even what we had last year, the numbers of CEOs of different organizations, leaders of council, whatever, if you collectively thought how many people their organizations represent, it's already an incredible body of people. But what's interesting, unlike other sort of gatherings, is that it's across all sectors. It's not the CBI representing business or whatever, I shouldn't probably mention them, but it's not the, NCVN or anything like that. It's across everybody. And that's different to anything else. When it comes to value, I think value is, we have got to realign this. When you talk to so many people in society and you talk about value, they only see it in one form, which is pounds. And that is not what value is. Value is measured sometimes in that way for certain reasons, but we all know that the value to society, to us as individuals, of our organizations, our institutions, etc., cannot just be based on the financial value. And GDP is a ridiculous thing anyway. You know, I mean, actually, how can you quantify the value of a nation simply by its GDP?
Isn't the classic quote that GDP measures everything except anything that's important?
Well, yes, yeah. Robert F. Kennedy said something very similar to that. So I think that this can happen if we collectively embrace it and start to demand it. And of course, actually, it goes back to, you know, consumer power and influence and all this, that, and the other. But fundamentally, we have to get people to be prepared to swim against what is the crowd, you know. And the only progress that's been made, even in the last 20 years on things, has been because people have said, I'm not going to report quarterly, or I'm not going to do this, or I'm not going to do that. You know, let's just be courageous in not being dragged along by the way in which so much is expected.
Thank you. Yeah, no, and again, back to the politicians that seem unwilling to, it feels to me like they've all bought this story that their electorate are short-term, are selfish, don't have much in common, are polarized, and so on, and seem to feel the need to play to that, and that's where I think both Anthropy, but also I think that in 5 years you're going to do Anthropy plus the mass mobilization. There's got to be, maybe it's not 5, but that, to show that actually we do have more in common.
Well, you're right, but I do think, Louise, and I don't want to be sort of misinterpreted here.
No.
I think that actually we're all responsible for the way in which our politicians behave. We are responsible because we have fueled the way in which media demand questions of them and things like that. I mean, actually, if you listen to the BBC News, for example, and you see a politician leave number 10, or if you see Rishi Sunak stand up at the G7 or whatever it is, and instead of getting a sensible question on a sensible issue, you get a media person saying, you know, asking some ludicrous question like, you know, do you believe in parties or whatever? I mean, it's just rubbish. It's literally just,
we're feeding different,
the lowest denominator of rubbish questions. And why? Because we, the populace, somehow have fueled this desire for the petty rather than the significant. So the poor old politicians are stuck in this situation where they're hammered by the media, because the media is more concerned about wallpaper and all of this sort of nonsense than it is about the issues that we really should care about, which is what's happening in our schools, what's happening in our hospitals, what's happening in our rivers, etc. So actually, I think politicians, I've met many over the decades, and they all go into public service for genuine reasons. But we are collectively responsible for what we get from them and the way in which they're influenced. So I'm not putting all the blame on them. I just wish that we would all collectively just sort of grow up and be a bit more sensible again, to be honest.
I feel like we need to give them a different story, a different view.
Well, they respond to what they think we need, and that is fed by whatever. You know.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating. I'm seeing more. So I'm going to try and cover as many questions because we're running out of time suddenly.
I'll try and make more succinct answers.
No, it's all good. So one was just on this inherent human trait, and do you think polarization is an inherent human trait, and is it just tech that allows that polarity to go deeper and faster than in 2012?
I think technology and social media amplifies both the best of humanity and the worst of humanity. We ourselves have to determine how we address that. I have very good friends who I see on Twitter who would never say things that they say on Twitter in real life, and I just don't know why they're tempted to do so, which is why I've come off Twitter and LinkedIn. So I'm not tempted to react in that way. So never blame the tool, blame the person using the tool. We're better than that.
Super. Carrie's got I think a really interesting one. So she says that she has moved past the language of human-centered design to embrace a sort of life-centered design, creating space for regeneration and including all of life and decisions. And she's wondering whether the Anthropy Charter might evolve in that direction, sort of widening that up, or maybe is that already intended and she's misinterpreting?
No, it's not a misinterpretation. I really, I think very carefully about language, and I'm not dismissive of anybody's use of other language. But the reason that it's there is formed in the basis of where it's evolved from. But I actually don't quite agree that we have to move on. I believe what should be good for the planet and good for nature should be good for humans and vice versa. I don't think there's actually a distinction. Now, people can argue with me, but frankly, I think if we consider ourselves above nature, we're lost. We're part of nature. Therefore, when I talk about what's best for humanity, it's what's best for nature and what's best for the planet, because we're one. So it's just interpretation more than anything else.
No, that's clear. Thank you. Michael Solomon, who was at Anthropy and is, are you coming back, Michael? Hopefully. He's asking whether you'll be or have invited the King to attend.
No.
No, is the answer?
I invited him last year and he wished us all very well and said things like, thank God somebody's doing something. But
good.
I haven't invited him this year, to be perfectly frank, Michael and everybody. I think that it's unlikely. And I also do feel, although people are interested in inviting other members of the royal family, I think this is something which doesn't want to be sidetracked too much by, other things. Well, but who knows in time.
Well, I thought you put it beautifully that as the Prince of Wales, he had an ability to put spotlight on certain issues that needed dealing with, and then action could happen. And I feel Anthropy is another part of maybe that equation somewhere, that not necessarily the same one. I don't know.
Yeah, and obviously, if he wants to roll up sometime, then he'd be very welcome, I'm sure. But who knows who might turn up when.
So a couple of other very sort of Anthropy specific questions. So one, Josie is saying the question of Britain's place in the world and the qualities it offers out is a really interesting and important one. Yeah. Where else could or should that conversation be happening? How do we really hear the perspective of our neighbours and global citizens, especially as Britain has had both positive and negative systemic impacts sort of historically?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I think this conversation should be happening elsewhere. I mean, I'm, every day I wake up and think, why the heck is it that I've had to create this thing? I mean, I'm happy to have, but, I'm just a person sitting in a little house in Shropshire. The reality is that I'm proud of this nation. I'm proud of what we've done. It's not always been right, but we have we are a global nation. We're not an inward-looking nation. When I see that on social media, it's ludicrous. So we need to hear from our friends overseas what they consider the best of us and what we can do better. And we should be embracing our international opportunity to, to improve things for everybody. I mean, we're all interconnected in that way. So, yeah, there should be more conversations about this in a positive way. And we need to do more of that at this Anthropy. It was a little bit of a struggle to try and get as much as I wanted last year. So I'm trying to enhance that this year.
Fantastic. And actually leads to Carrie. Future said she's wondering whether it's possible to bring a version of Anthropy to the US, because she's very inspired by the model and what she's seen.
You're not the first person who asked me if I could take it to the US. And I also got asked about whether or not she could go to, I think it was New Zealand and Finland or something. So I think there's always the opportunity. The ethos can be transferred, and of course, it would be wonderful to see things grow with the like-minded people doing other things. It's got to have a special place. It's got to have special people to bring it together. So the answer isn't no at all. It's, perhaps come and see what it is in the UK and then see whether or not we can transplant it. I mean, I've got, friends in the US from all different sectors, and I'm sure there are many connected here. I think it has. One thing I will say was that when I was inviting certain people who are already connected in lots of global forums and all the rest of it, one of the things was that they all felt that it was all too parochial, that it was too national, that they've got to be on the global stage and all the rest of it. I address that by saying that actually, this country is one we can get our arms around and perhaps make some change happen. And then it can feed up into the global stuff. But if the global stuff is just a talking shop and doesn't make change happen to the things that affect a country, then the disconnect isn't working anyway. So any country that needs a forum like this, then yes, be happy to share ideas and thoughts. I'd probably want to get through this Anthropy first, because there's a lot of work in the next 5 months.
Yeah, no, and And actually, Carrie would be the perfect person to carry that through. She's a powerhouse around system and systemic change. So Carrie, can we see you in the UK, please, at the end of this year?
Yeah, there you go.
I could certainly put you on a couple of panels if we can get through lots of ideas. And I had one, and I've just seen, I think Paul Haney has just posted the same one, which was, as you know, we do a lot of talking about regenerative, and that context and locality is really important. Is there a play to say, do we have mini anthropies around Britain potentially? Are there, and again, now we're playing and exploring, and you're probably thinking, oh, I've just done one, have another one to come.
Well, not surprisingly, lots of these ideas have arisen before, and we are still in a very early stage with getting anthropy into a sustainable model. People have lots of expectations on anthropy, and sometimes those expectations cannot be met, I'm afraid. However, there are people interested in regional sort of opportunities where perhaps in the next cycle we could have regional events that then send a delegation to the national event or something of that type. And that's certainly something that I'm happy to explore. So we have it as one of those ideas in a whole list that it's just finding the time with the limited resources we have to make that happen. It's a very good observation, and one that we are interested in.
Okay, so Paul Haney, that's one for the IOD in Scotland, which I know you're involved with.
Well, if there are people from our other nations, we tried hard to get Scots and Welsh and Irish there. We got a few, but not as many as we'd hoped. And if the solution is to have a sort of regional feed in, then that could well be something of interest.
Okay, I'm looking because there's suddenly a flurry of questions, and I'm trying to pick and some comments here and there. I saw a comment from Pauline somewhere, and it's gone. Well, I know, I can't see it. So this one is around thinking about diversity of experiences and effectiveness of problem solving, and sort of generational diversity. I don't think this is specifically aimed at anthropy, but do we sufficiently have all generations engaged in sort of solving the bigger problem in the right way, I guess?
Well, I don't know what the individual questions focus might be, but as far as I'm concerned, wisdom doesn't sit in one generation. You see things through the eyes of a child which are different to that of the adult. So, children and young adults should be able to bring that perspective, but obviously people we might classify as the elders, those that have lived for much longer, have views and experiences that we should share and embrace. Other societies around the world are far better than that, than our own. So I would say anything to do in that regard, I would encourage, and I try to encourage it at Anthropy. We have an emerging leaders program. We had, I think we had about 100 young people at Anthropy last year, certainly similar figures. And this is not random, this is not tokenism. These are, people who are doing stuff already, but equally, I hope we get people in their 80s and even 90s to be at Anthropy, bringing that together. I mean, I think everybody who's sensible knows that across the generations, you get a richness that you don't get if you just stay in a single way.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And actually, I think I love the idea of more people in their 80s and 90s at Anthropy. There's something about what roles we all have to play all the way up, rather than this idea of, well, the current leaders, let's say, in their, say, 60s, handing over to...
I joke with the team that I aim to be there when I'm in a bath chair being rolled out 30 years' time. So I'm hoping to be one of those at some point. Yeah.
Wonderful. Good. I'm looking for more questions. I apologize if we've missed any. There've been quite a lot today. What I can see in the chat, though, is that I think you have a mini anthropy or anthropoid. That's a new one, not an anthropist, but anthropoid, based in one of the Eden projects up north, so potentially in Dundee, is what's being plotted in the chat right now.
Yeah, well, I wondered about that. I didn't mention it, but there's also Morecambe as well. So there's started to spread around, I think. Yeah.
So,
you can always put up a temporary dome. You can hire them now, can't you? As well?
Oh, it's done. Yeah, yeah. So that's what the chat is going crazy on right at this moment. So Scotland is the next. You heard it here first. Scotland is the next, or the first anthropoid.
Right. Well, I'll put my trews on and get the Scottish branch of the family mobilised. Excellent.
That's fantastic. We are just about out of time, but I wanted to give you, just coming back to, as you said, let's think about what we're trying to do. We're trying to create a place where more people, everyone, and nature can flourish with a sort of a joint, and do that through a joint vision, answering these really important questions you've set out. One way that people can get involved is obviously come to Anthropy. They can also buy your books, should they wish. Well, I think we have them in our office. Actually, I should have asked you to sign them the other day. So anybody can drop past the Volans Somerset House office if they can, and read them or borrow them. But what else? What do you think is the biggest thing that we can either do or be?
Well, it sounds a bit of a, it may be a bit of a cliche and all the rest of it, but I would say the biggest thing I say to people is just be kind. I mean, I know that sounds, people say that, but, kind in your thought and kind in your behavior, kind in your social tweets, kind in the way in which you smile at somebody who may be on the bus or whatever the case may be. I think as a society, when we stop having time to be kind to people, what horrifies me is when somebody falls on the tram where's that, falls on on the underground. So I mean, nobody picks them up, or what, bikes, we're all in a rush. I think that's not the society we want to live in. So I think be kind is the biggest thing I'd say, in a simple thing. But part of that means that you are willing to go beyond your own network. So, if you're kind to somebody and you reach over and talk to strangers, that's how we connect together as people, by talking to those that we wouldn't otherwise talk. And I know some people will joke, I've known them for 20 years now, and some people say, oh, I made the mistake of sitting next to John O'Brien on a train or on a plane. And now, I've been working with him on projects for 20 years. But that's because, to be honest, I've just had this interest in people, and I hope that if people have an interest in things, that they gravitate around the same campfires and we start doing things together. And I don't care if people come back and make a joke that they've been stuck next to me on a train, because they keep coming back. So I always say, be friendly, be kind, reach out, have a conversation. And I'd also say the thing about Anthropy, just to be fair, because I know everybody does have a lot of expectations on it, it won't meet everybody's expectations. And it is designed for leaders. It's designed for those people. It's not going to be like Glastonbury with 20,000 people turning up. It's designed for those people that can influence their organizations or the communities they're in. And, it's pitched therefore in that particular way. And we try and bring a diverse range of thought, of age, cognitive diversity and experience. And, I hope that it works for the vast majority of people, the vast majority of time. And I look forward to seeing more people there. So, thank you so much for the time, and thank you for all the questions. And yeah, it's been a delight to come on.
Thank you so much. And as you know, we're great fans of Anthropy, and straight behind you what you're trying to do. So we'll continue to promote. And if anybody's got any questions, please, afterwards, they've all got my email, and we will send out a quick survey just to hear more, because there's lots of things John and I haven't talked about. I had a list of other things about how, about leadership, about all sorts of things. So we might have to take those another day. We're getting lots of thank yous in the chat, John.
No,
John,
thank you.
in a way that he can't see the chat, so just so that everybody knows, but we'll out and send it to you so you can have a.
Oh, that's very kind. Well, thank you so much. It is. I did. I don't do a lot of this because people don't ask me. Why would they? So it's really a privilege to be able to come on and chat about these things. And I do hope that if you can't make Anthropy, then look at the website. We're hoping to get more messages out after that, and we all have the ability to influence those around us. So thanks so much for giving the time.